Dr. Malloy, sorry, is faculty in the law school. He's a lawyer and also in the School of Public Health. He's the faculty director of the Sustainable Technology and Policy program at UCLA. And has a very interesting, varied background. Before he joined UCLA as a faculty, he actually worked for firms. He also worked at the US EPA. So he really has this intrinsic knowledge of, I would say, the real world that sometimes we faculty could lack, I would say. As Tim will tell us more about, a lot of his recent interests have been on these questions of decision making and how we can integrate these kind of safer, more prevention-based strategies into policy. Tim?
Thank you, Patrick. Those iPhones sound terrible. I'm glad to say I have a Samsung Galaxy, which is much safer. I'm thrilled to be here. This is such a tremendous group. I'm so excited to hear what's going to be happening in the panels. Now, if you're looking at the program, you may feel, hey, we're behind. Isn't it time for the break? It is. We're going to make up that time. I'm going to be a little shorter. I can't get much shorter than I am right now, but I'll be a little shorter. And then we'll carve some time out. So relax. We're going to get to that break in a second. So far we've heard about toxicology generally to give us that frame, you know, for those of us who don't already have it, that context. And then Patrick, a wonderful excursion through what are the hot topics. Now, I want to do a different bit of a frame. I want to talk about beyond regulation in the sense that we know that there are laws out there about that are meant to regulate, but we wanted to shift the focus here to what can be done, you know, outside the domain of regulation. And my job here is to kind of set that up to explain why it is we think that's important and, in fact, practical. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you a 3-minute tour of chemical regulation, and that's about it. That's all you're going to get. Then I'll talk about what I might call the limits of regulation, why it is that regulation is sufficient. It is necessary, I mean, but not sufficient to get us to where we ultimately want to be. And then we'll talk a little bit about moving beyond regulation. So I like to think about regulation, when it's a patchwork quilt. We've got the local level, the state level, the regional level, the federal level, the global level, all knit together. And then within those, we have different kinds of regulation functioning. Now, I won't go through all of them, but one of the big hitters is the Toxic Substances Control Act at the federal level in the United States, which was recently reformed. So this law was passed in 1976, and it governs both new chemicals, meaning chemicals that are created as time goes on, right? And it covers what we call existing chemicals, which means chemicals that were already in commerce in 1976, okay? But first, I'd like to go to the poll everywhere, if I may, because, oh, there's all my notes. Because what I'd like to do is kind of get the pulse of the room on how we, for those of you who are familiar with TOSC, and I get, looking around the room, I know many of you are. So here's the question. Are we better off now than we were 40 years ago? For those of you who can remember 40 years ago. For the rest of you, just imagine it, okay? Are we better off now than we were when we first started this effort to regulate chemicals? Better off in terms of, we could talk about, that's a great question. Do we have better regulation? I'm thinking more functionally here about, are we better off as a society in terms of the problems that we had back then and the problems we have now? And look, this is supposed to be fun. We're not going to I am a lawyer. I do have a tendency to want to parse through it, but we're just going to have a little fun here, okay? So looks like that is a beautiful histogram. Thank you. So now I'm going to give you my answer. Are we better off? Okay. Can I go back to the slide there? Let me talk about TOSCA, then I'm going to talk about all these other kinds of regulation. Are we better off? Well, it depends. Okay. Put aside the fact that there's more and more chemicals and emerging technologies that create more risks. That's something kind of exogenous to this question about how well is TOSCA and other regulation working generally. But if we look back to before 2016 when TOSCA was reformed, there was general agreement that TOSCA was just terrible, that it was a good idea. It had, there were, the principles underlying it were good, but its implementation, both as a structural matter in the statute and as a functional matter by the regulators, was pretty poor. Okay, so there was a major reform that took years and years to get through, and some people in here actually worked quite a bit on that to make it happen. So 2016, we get the new TOSCA. It does some really nice things. It gets rid of some of the problems that we used to have. It gives EPA more robust testing authority to go out and find out, do the kinds of things Patrick was talking about, right? It, for new chemicals, it puts some requirements on EPA to actually make decisions about whether these things are safe or not, and it forces them to be more open about what they're doing and to be more, to do that more quickly, right? For existing chemicals, it really restructured everything. It changed the standard by which EPA would make the decision about whether a chemical was safe. It took out the notion of considering cost, right? It created prioritization requirements so that EPA had to go look at the chemicals that were in commerce still, figure out what they were, and then prioritize them. And then it put them on a schedule to start doing risk evaluations and taking actions, all right? So it addressed many of the problems that old TOSCA had. And by the looks of it, you know, we're still like seeing how it's playing out, but we've got some good signs there. Recently there was a blog on EDF's website, and I recommend you go look at these. It's a great way to keep up with what's happening, that noted that for new chemical review, EPA was moving along and they were getting rid of the backlog and making some decisions. We've got, in January, we had proposals to either phase out or regulate some pernicious chemicals, including methylene chloride, right, which Patrick, I believe, you used a fancier name for it. But are you proud of me that I knew it, but that was actually a thing? Right, so they were taking some action. Now, it's not all good news. We had I don't know if you knew this, we had a change in administrations. And now, it's funny, you look at the budget, you look at, you know, the reform of TOSCA was a bipartisan effort, and it created statutory obligations. So those are all things that kind of push towards actually making this move forward and be implemented, regardless of the administrative context in which it's all happening. So, and we've got some signs that's happening. So that's all kind of good news. Here's the bad news. The bad news is that the chemicals program is not an island. As Patrick pointed out, there are there's research and development and other units in EPA that provide the science and the resources that make the TOSCA program implementation possible, and those, at least in the current budget, are slated for significant cuts. So what will happen? We don't know. So are we better off, worse off? I guess we would say stay tuned for that. Okay. Now, what about these other ones? I'm going to run through some of these other programs that we have on our quilt. So I talked about TOSCA. You know, we've got some what I would call companion statutes at the European Union level. We have REACH, which is also a very comprehensive regulatory system. It's a little bit different in that it is focused on driving substitution in a very express way under the regulation. Very similar to what we have here in California, the Safer Consumer Products Program, which is also focused on identifying safer alternatives and then driving adoption of them through the regulatory program. So they're all of kind of a type, right? We could bundle them together. HASCA, the Hazardous Substances Control Act, that's really kind of a model act that has been adopted across the country in various states, and it usually rests that authority in public health departments. And it actually has in the statute the authority for them to regulate toxic materials in a and there's some powerful authority in here. One of the drawbacks of that is it's kind of a sleeper statute. Not many people pay attention to it. I actually met with some folks in a public health department who will go unnamed, who when I mentioned to them, well, do you use your HASCA authority? They didn't even know they had that authority, right? So kind of a sleeper statute, but could roar if put to use, okay? Of course, we've got the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And Bernie's already talked about the fact that this has not been aggressive in terms of its ability to deal with toxic exposure for workers. And we really can't forget, the reason I have the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act up here is there's a growing trend to try and push towards ingredients disclosure for products, particularly personal care products. So the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act is one example, one of the few examples of where there's an ingredient disclosure obligation. So for personal care products, like when you look at them and you see all these ingredients listed on there, for those products, that's required in decreasing order of how much is in there. But for a lot of other products, like cleaning products and things like that, it's not required. And even for personal care products, fragrances, which contain some of the more suspect things that we might see in products that we purposely put on our bodies, are kind of just bundled under the word fragrance. So it's really hard to figure out what those things are. Okay, so there we've got it. We've got these statutes, and as Mike mentioned, why might we look beyond regulation? Well, obviously, the context in which we're in a deregulatory environment, so we would want to look at other ways of moving us towards safer society in terms of chemical exposure, just for that simple reason. But let's assume for a moment that we've actually got a well-funded, passionately implemented, functional program, right? So, and I think a lot of people hope that the new TOSCA, if it's implemented well, moves us along that way. So would it be enough if we had regulation that was funded and implemented in earnestly, right? And I think even then, that's not enough. We still need more. So now, you could quibble with kind of the details of what I'm going to show you, but I think the message comes through. So if you think about TOSCA addressing like 25 to 3,000 kind of major chemicals of concern, and you look at the schedule that's in there, the mandatory schedule that's in there, so think that whole pie are all those chemicals. The green are the number of chemicals that EPA is likely to get to in 30 years from the time they start TOSCA implementation. I think that says it all, right? I mean, earnestly implemented, fully funded, but there's still going to be a universe of chemicals that we're only going to get to slowly, right? So regulation, it's necessary, but it's not going to be sufficient, just for that reason. But there's another reason, right? Which is, when you think about regulation, there's standards that are applied, right? It depends, sometimes it's unreasonable risk. You can't have an unreasonable risk. Sometimes it's, we're going to get exposures down to acceptable risk levels, right? Or we're going to restrict this exposure or that exposure. And the thing to remember that is that regulation reflects the outcome of a process of trade-offs, right? Most of these chemicals that are in the market are there because somebody wants to use them in a product that you and I want to buy, and they serve a function, right? So when we're restricting them, we're making a trade-off, right? In the efficacy of that product, or in the economics of the economic benefits that flow from having that product, right? So there's a trade-off there. But there's other trade-offs, right? For example, I may be more risk adverse than most of the population, or even a large minority of the population. So acceptable risk that's defined quite earnestly at the regulatory level may not be safe enough for me, right? Why? Because I make a different set of trade-offs. So if we respect the individual autonomy, the notion that folks are going to want to make their own trade-offs, make their own judgments, then it's not going to be enough to have a regulation, because the regulations will always represent kind of a societal compromise over trade-offs that won't necessarily reflect large portions of different groups within societies or individuals, right? I like to think you've probably seen this when you've walked into a restaurant, right? This reflects people have different preferences and values, and depending on what your values are, you're going to have a different outcome. Doesn't mean one of these is right and one of these is wrong. It reflects a different set of values that we might all respect the ability of the other folk to have that. But regulations, they pick one set of trade-offs. So we need to move beyond regulation if we want to be able to see our preferred set of trade-offs to be reflected in the products that we buy, in the place that we work, and the society in which we may live. So here's the conventional view. We tend to think about regulation regulates the firm, and we get it to the place where we want it to be. But I want to move beyond that, right? So what are the ways in which we can move beyond it? Well, one is reflecting the fact that the consumer can take action. And the consumer can affect the firm, in a sense, regulate the firm without government being involved in it, right? Simply by making the choice. I don't buy that product, I buy the other one. I go to Whole Foods to buy my product, I don't go to Smart & Final, right? Nothing against Smart & Final, they've got some very good products there. But I think you get my sense. It's like I vote with my feet and hopefully the marketplace follows, right? That won't always happen, and I'm going to talk about some of the things that we need in order to kind of make that a meaningful mechanism to get to the kind of substitution that Patrick's talking about. But note, you know, in a way, this goes, the consumer may do that just by making a choice without intentionally attempting to affect the firm behavior, but you consumers also have the ability to directly affect firm behavior, right? In the ways in which they interact with them, express their views with them, or join together or support NGOs that are attempting to, you know, provide a vehicle by which like-minded folks can have collective action, right? So we can also have the NGOs playing a very important role. And I didn't draw all the arrows here because it would get kind of busy, but obviously the consumer may also be driving the NGO, and likewise the NGO driving the consumer. And obviously there's lots of other pieces of society out here beyond my simplified view of it, but I think you get the idea of what I'm talking about. But if we want this to happen, if we want to enable this, there are certain things that these actors, particularly consumers, are going to need. Like one thing they're going to need is information. How do you know which can to pick? You're frustrating, Patrick, right? We know we don't want BPA, but I still, you know what? I still need to get receipts. I still need to use cans. So what do I pick? I need the information in order to make that vote with my pocketbook, right? And how do I make that decision? I also will need resources. And this could be everything from the money to be able to afford the safer product to the cognitive freedom to make devote the cognitive energy to that. We all are busy people, right? And the time it takes to make these kinds of decisions, to do the research, to find the safer product, that's a cognitive resource that's being used up. We need to find ways to provide people with support for those kind of cognitive resources that have to be used. And then lastly, we need some methods. Look, you know, last night, and you'll see why, I was in a natural food store and then a CVS buying shampoo. Not for that, but thank you, right? But to be able to, later on I'm going to compare some shampoos. But what are the tools that I can use to compare it, right? I talked about trade-offs, and Patrick talked about trade-offs, and so did Bernie. So as a consumer, we're going to have tools that allow us to make those trade-offs in rational ways, or at least ways that we like to make decisions, right? So we're going to need those things. One last thing, okay? All this is focused on the firm and trying to affect it from the outside, right? But let's remember, you know, we all like to complain about, you know, I don't know, McDonald's, Walmart, you know, pick your favorite corporation to complain about. You've had a bad experience at Chipotle or whatever, right? But they're not really people, despite what the Supreme Court says, right? They're just collections of people. So we got to look inside of the firm to think about how the firm itself might drive change. And when we think about the firm itself driving change, we're really talking about the people that make up that firm, right? So we've got corporate headquarters. I don't know if that's coming through or not, but up here we got corporate headquarters. So management at the top level can drive change if they're committed to moving to safer alternatives and less toxic processes, right? But sometimes that change isn't there, and the push to change in the firm will come from somebody else. You know, maybe the environmental department or the sustainability division will push to drive change by affecting other parts within the firm, right? But even that's not the only driver of change within a firm. Let's dissect them some more. Shareholders can have an effect, and we've all seen examples of this where active shareholders are trying to get companies to adopt policies on chemical, on e-waste, on climate change, right? So all of these folks will can affect change. And also, if the conditions are right, workers can affect change within the firm, right? So these are non-regulatory ways in which we can drive change, but of course, they will need some things that make that happen too. And we're going to hear about some of these things, both with respect to consumers and NGOs, and now also with respect to businesses in the next 3 panels that come. So let me just give you a heads up about what do firms need in order to drive change. Well, many of the things are very much like what I show with consumers, but one thing they're going to need are values. That is a commitment to the normative value of sustainability, safer substitution, so on and so forth. We're going to hear about firms where that is actually built into the corporate charter, right? That they're not just profit maximizers, they're meant to do social good as well. And the other stuff is similar ways. They're going to need resources, obviously, both the firm and folks within the firm. They're going to need information. And, you know, a lot of times folks think, oh, well, the firm who's producing the product, they'll know. They can just take one chemical out and put another chemical in. But the thing we have to realize is depending on what sector we're in and the size of the company and what they're making, many times they don't know what's in their product. They're buying other products from someone in the supply chain, and those folks up in the supply chain, they're not willing or they don't even know what's in those products. So information is also a barrier to movement within firms as well. Again, they need methods. If they want to design out, say, methylene chloride in a paint stripper, what are they going to put in and what are the trade-offs that creates? They need a method that's often known as alternatives analysis or alternatives assessment to help them make that choice. We'll hear more about that today. And then, of course, within all of this, they're going to need a culture and a set of incentives in the firm that tell everybody in that firm that the value that's been stated and the resources that are available actually need to be used to drive the kind of change that those values reflect. Okay. I've said enough. Hopefully I've convinced you now that you don't need regulation, and I've talked myself out of a job as a regulatory lawyer, right? But with that, I'll end, and I think we're going to be heading to break. Is that right? So we're a little bit behind, but we'll catch up. So we're going to shorten our break.